Five Nights at Freddy's is one of the most well-known game franchises of our generation, created by indie game developer Scott Cawthon. They have dozens of games, books, a movie, plushies, and a tabletop game? The more you know. But anyways, Five Nights at Freddy's is a huge franchise spanning across several forms of media that's been released throughout the past decade. Each game has its merits and downfalls, but I want to talk about the most slept-on game in the franchise, Five Nights at Freddy's 4. In fact, compared to its predecessors, Five Nights at Freddy's 4 is the lowest rated game among both critics and fans, with a critic score of 51 and fan score of 6.7. Now, obviously, I heavily disagree with that score. I mean, why would I be making this video otherwise? I think FNAF 4's dip in popularity was less about the game design and more about the culture the previous games created. The previous Five Nights at Freddy's games were a bit camp. We had our silly little phone guy, fun Easter eggs like squeaky noses, and the outlandish idea that the reason these animatronics are attacking you is because they want to stuff you in a suit. I mean, it is a bit silly, but overall, very, very fun. With Five Nights at Freddy's 4, though, the story shift is incredibly jarring, far more serious and sinister. Before, your avatar was an adult working the night shift at a pizzeria, and now you're a helpless little boy trapped in his bedroom. The curated expectations for the game were flipped on its head, and maybe that was a shift the audience wasn't prepared for, but the shift does make for a unique game in the Five Nights franchise. Now, I've always had some innate fear towards this game. In fact, Five Nights at Freddy's 4 is the only FNAF game in the franchise that I never experienced myself, until now. In attempting to prove a point, I had to face the game I never dared to touch with a 10-foot pole. Now, I like to believe that I'm a pretty hard person to scare. Okay, so night one is not going well so far, guys. But this game got my ass. In playing this, I found that elements of the game, such as sound design, art style, avatar choice, and narrative themes, add to the terror of Five Nights at Freddy's 4 in a unique way that its predecessors didn't. And because of this, I believe that FNAF 4 is not only the best installment in the franchise, but also one of the scariest survival horror games on the market. Five Nights at Freddy's has a knack for turning our cherished Chuck E. Cheese-esque animatronics into terrifying monsters, and these ones are the most monstrous yet. I want to discuss the idea of the uncanny, and unfortunately to do that, I must talk about my nemesis, Sigmund Freud. A fun fact about me is, I hate Sigmund Freud. I think he's a little freak, and the psychological community needs to agree to stop teaching his weirdo theories. But I digress. Freud suggests that the uncanny is undoubtedly related to what is frightening, to what arouses dread and horror. He continues to explain that the uncanny is the class of the frightening, which leads back to what is known of old and long familiar. That is to say, we can understand the uncanny as the feeling of wrongness at a once familiar object, a distortion of reality. I believe that the regular Five Nights at Freddy's animatronics themselves fall into the uncanny valley, but these new ones don't. No, we've moved past the uncanny valley and just dove straight into terrifying imagery. In a way, the FNAF 4 animatronics are uncanny since they are a gross distortion of once familiar characters, not only from our childhood, but from the FNAF series thus far, into an almost unrecognizable, horrific amalgamation. Never before have the animatronics been displayed in such a gruesome manner. Dull plastic teeth are now sharp fangs surrounding the maw of these robots' mouths. What used to be soft paws are now claws, and the innocuous plastic eyes now glow red. Their physical depiction has been subverted from our previous expectations of what Foxy, Freddy, Chica, and Bonnie look like. In this way, they've become less eerie and more just downright scary. Again, I think this subversion is why the fan reception was so low, but it is undoubtedly a scarier game because of it. Now, as we venture from the unsettling depths of the uncanny to the chilling realm of jump scares, we find ourselves confronted by another crucial feature in the horror game genre, Sound design. Sound design is one of the most important parts of a jump scare. Without the correct pitch and tone to add to the visual fright, we get anticlimactic jump scares like the one seen from Springtrap in Five Nights at Freddy's 3. With that being said, how do you ensure that the sound and visuals work together rather than against each other? The way auditory and visual cues are processed is in two separate areas of the brain. Auditory stimuli is processed in the temporal lobe, whereas visual stimuli is processed in the occipital lobe of the primary cerebral cortex. Because of this, the brain is being stimulated in two regions, so one must work with both areas accordingly to get a good scare. In a study performed by Kemp, he found that auditory stimulus takes only 8 to 10 milliseconds to reach the brain, but on the other hand, a visual stimulus takes 20 to 40 milliseconds, highlighting the importance of a rounded auditory experience because that's the first line of contact between the player and the jump scare, and Five Nights at Freddy's 4 executes this perfectly. The previous Five Nights at Freddy's games rely on visual cues the most for self-preservation, looking through cameras, checking vents and door entrances, and with that, there is constant noise. In FNAF 1, the player receives a lot of visual and auditory stimulation. The camera makes noises as you flick to each one, the door makes a sound when you close it, and the lights buzz when clicked. But the most important aspect is the constant white noise present in the office. We see this presence of constant noise repeated in the next two games. In FNAF 2, there's a music box auditory cue, thumping in the vents, and most notably, a reverberating echo that plays throughout the night. Again, FNAF 3 features Balloon Boy echoes, beeping as you close the vents, and the very important constant low hum. In these games, the sound is lackluster and omnipresent. We're processing these subpar noises before a great visual scare, and because of that, our brain is already so occupied that the jump scare is diluted. But FNAF 4 is different. Before you even begin playing, you receive a message instructing you to adjust your volume until you hear crickets, immediately tipping the player off to the fact that listening will be the most important mechanic in this game. Suddenly, instead of your eyes flitting from camera to camera, your character is looking into a seemingly endless void, waiting for a breath or a thump in the night as a means of self-preservation. This shift in focus causes the player to strain their ears more than their eyes, making the visual scares just that more intense. Additionally, there is perpetual silence. The only sounds are triggered by player actions like running to the door, closing it, and flicking the flashlight. Only diegetic sounds are present, keeping the player heavily rooted in reality. Sitting in the endless silence with little visual stimuli makes the player that much more tense, as they have nothing constantly engaging their brain. In a way, the player is being deprived of sensory information, and often this leads the brain to come up with noises to fill the gaps. And because of that, when playing this game, I felt empty. I mean, I even attempted to fill the silence with my nonsensical yapping. My palms are sweaty, knees weak, arms are heavy, there's vomit on his sweater, mom's spaghetti, he's nervous. I don't know the controls, but on the surface he looks calm and ready. These components of sound design highlight that, unlike the previous Five Nights at Freddy's games, you are just a lonely child, forced to sit in the dark, completely alone with your thoughts, and the monsters lurking in what you thought was a safe place, leaving you completely vulnerable. Unlike the previous games, in Five Nights at Freddy's 4, we play as a young boy, classifying him as a vulnerable avatar. A vulnerable avatar can be defined as a playable character part of a traditionally at-risk population. Vulnerable avatars are typically women and children, as because of societal standards, created by the patriarchy and whatnot, these populations are seen as helpless. Think about what you hear during an evacuation. Many evacuation notices follow the Birkenhead drill, an unofficial code of conduct whereby the lives of women and children were to be saved first in a life-threatening situation. So, with that being said, how does a vulnerable avatar add to the fear of survival games? Well, in Chapter 2 of Emily Ray's book, The Child in Games, titled Representations of Children in Video Games, she examines depictions of children in contemporary video games, highlighting why a little kid may be chosen as the playable character rather than the typical hero type. She states the absence of playable child characters from certain game genres can be attributed to the goal of fulfilling players' power fantasies. With a child, however, she states that as a representative of a social group that is both physically and structurally vulnerable, the child does not connote strength, influence, or importance, and is therefore not an obvious choice to represent an overpowered heroic figure whose abilities greatly exceed those of an average person. That is to say, children aren't featured in action games because the player is meant to feel powerful, When playing a child, the player is rendered helpless because children represent fragility, innocence, and defenselessness. However, these weaknesses are perfect in a survival horror game. What makes the avatar susceptible to danger adds to the anxiety and tension. In this way, Five Nights at Freddy's 4 gives us the perfect avatar, a completely helpless boy at mercy to demons of his own creation. Furthermore, the setting in which we play adds to the vulnerability displayed by the avatar. In the previous Five Nights games, we play out the night as a security officer in a pizzeria, or a horror attraction in the case of FNAF 3. The importance of this location is that 1. This is a secondary location that we always leave at 6 a.m. 2. We are choosing to be there. And 3. We are implied to receive monetary compensation at the end, implying a reward for our arduous efforts. This setting is vastly different from the 4th game. In Five Nights at Freddy's 4, we are trapped in our own home, with no escape, doomed to live out this hellish nightmare 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with our only reward being our life. The game is limited to 5 nights, unless you're a masochist and play nights 6 and 7, because that's the name of the game. I mean, literally. However, it's not too far-fetched to believe that our avatar has been experiencing this daily nightmare for an indeterminable amount of time. There's no escape from the monster when it's invaded your home. Even outside the 12 to 6 a.m. cycle, our avatar is harassed and traumatized by his older brother. Our safe space has been infiltrated, leaving us with no escape. Our vulnerable avatar is stuck in a perpetual cycle of fear and agony forever, making it a very harrowing narrative experience. The culmination of these game design elements leads to an exciting and unique horror experience that I just think isn't present in the other games. It paves the way for a new, more interesting story that is, unfortunately, a one-time thing in the franchise. And while Five Nights at Freddy's 4 isn't the highest rated game in the franchise, it is the highest rated game in my heart. Anyways, if you like this video, please make sure to not press that subscribe button. As much as I'd love to continue to yap on the internet, I hate video editing software, and I never want to do this again. But thank you so much for watching.